Hi, everybody. This is Elizabeth Wilson. I'm the director of the Irving Institute for Energy and Society at Dartmouth, and this is our new energy series, something that I have grown to really love over the last few weeks. And today I'm especially excited to have it co-hosted by my friend and colleague, Paulina Jaramillo at Carnegie Mellon, who will be introducing our speaker. Just remember, your Q&A, you can submit questions in the Q&A box below. And with that, I'll turn it over to Paulina. Thank you again, everybody. We really hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I'm also happy to be co-hosting this and having participated in the previous seminars. Today, I'm very happy to introduce Michael Craig, who's an assistant professor of energy systems in the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. Michael has a BA in environmental studies from Washington University in St. Louis. He then went to MIT, where he got a master's in technology and policy. And he then came to Carnegie Mellon University and completed his PhD in the Department of Engineering and Public Policy. And I had the privilege of working with him during his time at CMU. As a professor at Michigan, he works on decarbonization, power system optimization, and net zero energy systems. And today he's going to be talking about his work on the power system operations under a changing climate. As a reminder, Michael will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll open. You can give your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, and I will moderate the Q&A session. So, Michael, it's your turn now.
Super. Thanks so much for the introduction. Please, if we were having some technical difficulties before, and I apologize for the weird video setup, but Paulina, if you just unmute your video at any point, then I'll know something's wrong. It's lovely to be here. Thanks so much. It's been a great series, and I really appreciate the organizers organizing it, and especially the invitation here. And the privilege was all mine in working with Paulina. My talk is titled Electricity Systems in a Changing Climate. I'm going to be talking about two different streams of work that I've had the pleasure of working on at Carnegie Mellon, as well as at the National Renewable Energy Lab. But just to kick things off, let's frame the issue here. Climate change, we all know, is coming. In fact, we already experienced some impacts today, but we expect to see more impacts coming in the near future. And climate change has some physical impacts in our environment. We can expect to see increasing river temperatures, decreasing river levels, and then changes in wind and solar resources and increases in air temperatures. And of course, these physical impacts will vary depending on where you are and across time, but generally these are trends that we see, at least across the United States. And we can link each of these physical impacts to different parts of the electric power sector. Thermal power plants, for instance, we see increasing river temperatures, decreased river levels, and increasing air temperatures all affecting them. And these two news articles on the bottom are there because we have actually already seen curtailments in thermal power plants, them having to shut down or reduce their power output because river temperatures are already too high. Next, we have hydropower plants. As we change river levels or as we increase river temperatures, then we can expect to see changes in hydropower generation. If wind and solar resources change, we expect to see changes in wind farm and solar farm output, and increasing air temperatures can also reduce our solar farm output, especially during the hottest days of the year. And finally, increasing air temperatures will increase electricity demand in areas where we have air conditioning. Now, none of this is really new, and I'm not going to be focusing on individual ones of these arrows in this talk. In fact, that slide was basically built on hundreds of papers that have been published, linking each one of these individual components or several of these components to particular impacts. And so here's a great example of this, a Nature Climate Change paper from 2015. The circles on the Western United States are showing you capacity reductions in different hydropower and thermal power plants across the Western United States. Now, these bubbles are shaded and colored and sized based on the size of the capacity reduction. But what this paper is really showing you is that we can experience capacity reductions. The question that I have when I look at this paper, though, thinking about power systems as interconnected systems, is are all these capacity reductions happening at the same time, or are we able to offset some reductions in some places with available capacity in other places. It's a very different thing to handle when all your capacity reductions happen simultaneously versus them being staggered in time. And so that theme of system level impacts, trying to collect these different impacts on time synchronous basis and across these different parts of the power system are really what the two research projects that I'm going to present to you have been focused on. And so in particular, we're going to be looking in one paper on how river temperatures and air temperature changes affect electricity demand, thermal power plants, and hydropower plants. And in another work, we're going to focus more on renewable resource changes, but also add the element of increasing air temperatures and how that changes thermal power plants and electricity demand. The rest of the talk is going to be focused on those impacts in the context of power system planning. So I want to first, again, just as background, walk through a schematic of how we think about planning power systems so we're all on the same page moving into the actual research papers. Here on the left-hand side, we have a hypothetical system. This is just an illustrative schematic. On the y-axis, we have firm capacity, or how much capacity we can rely on to meet peak demand. And we're going to start with this column that says no impacts. Let's assume climate change is not going to happen. We're not accounting for any climate impacts. And we have some thermal power plants, we have hydro, and then we have a decent amount of wind and solar power. And the solid black line there is our peak demand value, but we typically build power systems with some reserve margin in mind. And so the dashed line is our planning reserve margin. Now we can walk through each component that we talked about in the prior slide and think about it in the context of planning. First, we have thermal curtailments or reduced efficiency, and so we get a little bit less firm capacity out of our thermal power plants. Next, we might have less generation potential, especially during the summer, in our hydropower facilities. And we might see changes in wind and solar resources, so they all contribute less. And finally, we see a big jump up in that solid black line and in the dashed black line, indicating that our demand has increased significantly, and that also means our reserve margin needs to increase as well. And so what this is meant to represent is that if we're not thinking about or planning for climate change, we're going to underinvest in our resources, and that can lead to under-reliable systems. And that gap in the top right of this figure is very bad. That's indicating to us that we do not have enough capacity to meet our required demand to ensure that margin, and we want to avoid that at all costs in planning. So the presentation we're going to focus on is really going to be trying to create this illustrative schematic in the context of real data and real analyses and real systems. And so the first paper that we're going to look at is how different climate change impacts compound one another across time. And the second will be looking at time series analysis, but putting them into an optimization model to build out our power system fleet in the context of climate change. And this paper was part of a National Renewable Energy Lab LGRD project, and it was led by Carla Brancucci, who's now at NCORD, and my other co-authors, Paulina Brahmataz-Hodge and Bart Nyssen. So our key research question here is thinking about these individual impacts on thermal power plants, wind and solar, and electricity demand, and understanding, are these synchronous impacts that are going to compound one another, or are they asynchronous and not compounding? When I see an increase in electricity demand, do I also see an increase in thermal deratings, such that I need more capacity, but at that same time I'm actually getting less? Or is my demand increasing at one period of time and my deratings are increasing at a separate period of time, and so they're not really additive to one another in the system? And that's what we're going to look at in the system of Texas. We're going to look at how changes in wind, solar, thermal deratings, and electricity demand might interact to affect our planning decisions. And in the paper, we examined 3 high stress periods: high demand, high net demand, and high system ramps. We're only going to focus on high demand in this presentation, but if you're curious about the others, I have them in the backup slides, or you can just go look at the paper. So we're going to take a 3-step or 4-step approach to answering this question. What we're trying to do is quantify synchronous climate change impacts on a future power system in Texas. So first, we need to create a future power system in Texas, a system that has high renewable penetrations. Second, we need to generate high resolution weather variables to understand how wind and solar resources and how our demand are changing. And so we're going to generate those variables for RCP 8.5 by mid-century. Finally, we're going to estimate available wind, solar, and thermal capacity and electricity demand on a synchronous basis, basically generate 4 synchronous time series of data. And then we'll aggregate across those impacts during those high stress periods that we talked about, in particular focus on high demand periods to understand whether these impacts on wind and solar deratings and demand are compounding or not. So first we need to generate our high renewable system. We're going to use some output from another NREL project that is citing wind and solar resources for us. You can see the map on the right. In general, we get solar in high resource areas and wind in high resource areas, but these power plants are pretty well distributed across the state. And we see capacity of wind and solar on the order of what we see in natural gas combined cycle plants. So this is a very high renewable system. Once we have our system, we need those meteorological variables. So to get those meteorological variables, we work with Oak Ridge National Lab to generate sets of variables for a reference or historic period and for a future climate period. Our climate change projections, like I said, are RCP 8.5 for mid-century, and our reference period is 96 through 05. At the top, what we're using is a reanalysis data set, and then the weather research and forecasting model, WRF. And so our reanalysis data set is at very coarse resolution. We're gonna take that reanalysis data set, force WRF with it, and WRF will give us high resolution weather variables. For the future, we need to account for the impacts of climate change. And so we're gonna add 2 steps in the front of that. We're gonna take GCM output, global climate model output, downscale it with a regional climate model, Reg CM4, and use that future regional climate model output to tweak the reanalysis data set to represent future atmospheric conditions rather than historic weather conditions. And then we follow the same process. And so really, we're almost doing 2 downscaling steps. We downscale from the GCM to the regional climate model, and then we downscale from the regional climate model again through WRF into the weather variables that we're going to use. And so from this output, what we get are 5 sets of variables using 5 sets of GCMs and a set of historic weather variables. And once we have those weather variables, we can then go through various steps to get our demand and wind, solar, and thermal capacity forecasts. So let's talk more about those different steps. To estimate electricity demand, we're going to use a piecewise linear regression function. Like I said at the very beginning, there are a lot of papers that do this analysis, linking air temperature to electricity demand, and then using that and applying it to future climate data to understand how demand might change. And so using a piecewise linear regression is a well-established method in literature. I'm just going to briefly show you the regression in case anybody really loves regressions here. The variable that we're trying to predict is hourly demand. And we're going to have the main regression coefficient is on our hourly air temperature values, but then we also include several fixed effects like what year am I in, what weekday, or am I in a weekday or weekend, am I in an hour of day, and then we have our intercept and error terms. And from this, just in the bottom right, the red line is our piecewise linear regression fit, and the cloud of points is our historic data that we're fitting it on. And you can see this U shape in Texas because we use electricity for heating. We have an increase in demand at very low temperatures, and we have an increase in demand at very high temperatures. And we can see that piecewise linear regression is well reflecting the actual shape of the underlying data. Next, we need wind and solar generation. Here we're going to use an NREL, National Renewable Energy Lab product called the System Advisor Model. We input our resource data like wind speeds or DNI and DHI to get our hourly wind generation and solar generation profiles. And we do this, we apply SAM to each of those wind and solar farms that we showed you in the prior slide. So these are farm-specific output values based on farm-specific resources. And finally, we need to estimate thermal deratings. Here we're going to make this a function only of air temperature, relative humidity, and air pressure. Other papers, and the paper that I'll show you later, look at how water availability also affects deratings. We do not consider that here. But again, we're using a set of linear regressions that were developed by one of Paulina's students, Aviva Lowe. Ultimately, what we get out of this are 4 different time series of data: demand, generation profiles, and thermal deratings. So our job here now is to take these 4 time series and look at how they change synchronous with one another. So we're going to start with just looking at the reference period. No climate change. I just want to give you a sense for what these different time series of data look like. On the y-axis, we have our demand or thermal deratings or wind and solar generation. And across the x-axis, we have our high demand hours. That's the high stress period we're looking at. We go from 1 to 20. Blue is demand, and each individual line is showing you the 10 years from our reference period. So we see demand is roughly around 50 gigawatts in any given hour. We have wind and solar generation, a lot of it in these high demand hours because we have a high wind and solar system. And finally, we have some minimal deratings on the order of 5 gigawatt hours on each of these high demand hours. So this is without climate change. We want to understand how these change with climate change. And so we can look at that component by component. So now the y-axis is going to be the change induced by climate change. And so that first box, for instance, is going to tell us how does demand change due to climate impacts? And the x-axis is the same. We have those high demand hours. So let's look just at demand at first. We have 5 shaded lines. We're running this for 5 different GCMs. And so we see those 5 GCMs. And then the thick line is a median across those different GCM values. So across GCMs, we see an increase in demand in our high demand hours, very consistent with prior work. And we see the median is also above 0. We can then look at thermal deratings. And here we're really getting at this compounding message. Are thermal deratings increasing when we also see an increase in demand during those high demand hours? And the answer is yes, we do. We see that across all those 5 GCMs in nearly every single high demand hour, we see an uptick in thermal deratings, and the median across the 5 is also positive in all of those hours. We do not, however, see the same trend across wind and solar generation. We see inconsistent effects across those high demand hours. And so our ultimate conclusion that we can pull from this, at least for a high demand, although you can trust me that we observe similar things for high net demand and high ramp in the paper, is that we see demand and thermal derating impacts compounding one another in these high stress periods. So not only do you have to worry about meeting that increase in demand, you also simultaneously need to worry about having less capacity available to you from your thermal power plants. And so maybe it's not a good idea to build thermal power plants given that climate change is going to reduce their contribution to system reliability in the future. And maybe wind and solar generation, given these inconsistent impacts, maybe they would be good investments to make to mitigate those thermal deratings. And that's exactly what we look at in this second paper, is taking these impacts, embedding them into the planning process and asking, how do my planning decisions change? Do I invest in different resources? And so that's the focus of the second work, capacity expansion of electricity generation fleet under climate change. And here there's many co-authors. This was a multi-year project led by Paulina, funded by the National Science Foundation. And this is currently in review at Applied Energy. And really, Francisco has led this for several years at the student level. And all the pretty graphics that you will see are thanks to Francisco, who is a wizard with graphics. All right, so let's go back to our original schematic. We had this schematic showing you in general how we plan for power systems, firm capacity on the y-axis. For each individual component, we see small reductions in usable capacity due to climate change. And we're trying to avoid this top right situation where we have a gap between the firm capacity that we built and our planning reserve margin. So our research question in this paper is not to do a time series analysis like we did before. Instead, we actually want to model planning decisions, investment decisions by a power system to understand how your decisions might change if we account for thermal impacts, hydropower impacts, and demand impacts. And again, we're going to use a 4-step process. Here, we're going to generate high-resolution weather and hydrological variables. In the last presentations, we did not do any hydrology modeling. We did not forecast river temperature or river levels, and so our deratings were purely a function of air temperature. In this paper, we are going to do the hydrological modeling. In particular, UW and PNNL are going to do the hydrological modeling. And so we generate weather and hydrological variables for a reference and for a future climate. And here we're going to do RCPs 4.5 and 8.5 by mid-century. Next, similar to the last paper, we're going to take those weather variables and link them to changes in demand and hydro and thermal capacity. Next, we're going to build a capacity expansion model, and we're going to take these different climate impacts and embed them inside of that model. And finally, with that model, we can quantify how climate change will change our investments. If we plan for a future without climate change versus if we plan for a future with climate change, how does that change our investment decisions and also our dispatch decisions? Last paper, we looked at Texas. This paper, we're going to look at the Southeast United States, or SERC for the people who have memorized all the NERC reliability areas. And SERC is a thermal and hydropower dominated system. We're going to break it up into 4 subregions here. And you can see this map is showing you the locations of different power plants. And in particular, we see a lot of thermal power plants and a lot of hydropower plants. This chart on the right is showing you installed capacity in the system as it exists today. Roughly a third coal, roughly a third gas, and roughly a third nuclear and hydro. Very small contributions from wind and solar. And I should say, based on the start of this project, this data is probably 3 or 4 years old, but nonetheless, largely still thermal and hydropower dominated system. Now, the schematic for this paper is a little more complicated than the last figure. So we're not going to go into details. We're just going to cover at a high level what we are trying to do. First, we need to generate those future weather variables. In particular, we need the meteorological variables, and we need our hydrological variables. So we're going to begin with the MET variables, and we're going to use them. We're going to generate them with climate models. And we're going to use 20 different global climate models here. And after some downscaling, that's the climate data that we're going to use. So that's at box A, circled by red. We're going to take that data from the 20 different GCMs, and we're going to use it to force these different hydrological models. We have runoff models, VIC, and we also have river routing models, RBM, and finally, we have river temperature models. River temperature is RBM, the routing is Mozart WM. And so we started with just meteorological variables. Now we've gone from air temperature, precipitation, down to how much water is in our streams in the future and in our rivers, and what is the temperature of those rivers. So now we have all we need to forecast demand and thermal deratings. And so that is the next step. We're going to use an electricity demand model and similar derating models as I showed you last time to go from those meteorological and hydrological variables to future demand and future hydropower generation and future thermal curtailments. And finally, we have all we need to really get our capacity expansion model stood up and running. And so we're going to take that data and feed it all up into our capacity expansion model. Now the capacity expansion model can include the reductions in thermal capacity we expect to see in the future, the changes in hydropower generation that we expect to see, and the changes in electricity demand that we expect to see. Now, one limitation of this work is that we're going to use current wind and solar resources. In the last presentation, we talked about forecasting wind and solar using WRF. That was a very time intensive and very costly process. And so this paper is focused instead on thermal deratings, hydropower, and demand. Although in the review that was set at the beginning of this whole presentation, in general, those impacts on demand and hydro and thermal are generally more consistent and more robust than the changes we see in wind and solar factors. And that's drawing from a wide range of papers in the United States, I should say. So we ran our capacity expansion model, and what do we get out of it? We get out some future generator fleet. And we're going to run this for 3 different scenarios. We're going to have a reference scenario, which is historic conditions, no climate change. We're going to have a future climate change scenario, 4.0, and we're going to have a 3rd scenario for RCP 8.5. And I know there's contention. If you go read Twitter debates about RCP 4.5 versus 8.5, you might need some cartoons afterwards. Thank you, happy person, at least for me personally. I will note that we are running this for mid-century. 4.5 and 8.5 are largely similar through mid-century, and you will see it reflected in our results. So if we were to do this for 2100, then we might see more differentiation between these 2 future climate scenarios, and then have more of a debate about the validity of RCP 8.5. But in this paper, since we're in mid-century, these are going to be similar. So let's look at those resulting generator fleets in that reference versus the future climate scenarios. So in our reference case, what we see is an expansion of wind and solar relative to what we have now, but still a system dominated really by natural gas, hydropower, coal, and nuclear. And in particular, we have a lot of natural gas combined cycle plants, roughly 50% of our capacity. And most of those are using recirculating cooling, which is moderately robust to changes in water, although dry cooling is the most robust. So this is our reference case, assuming no climate change. How does climate change our results? We see our 2 different scenarios on the right, 4.5 and 8.5. And the thing that should jump out at you is that we build a lot more capacity and that we have a lot more solar as a % of our total generator fleet, somewhat at the expense of wind, but largely at the expense of natural gas plants. So why does our installed capacity increase? That's indicating our demand has significantly increased in the future, which we saw before and which we are now seeing again, and which is consistent with the broad literature. But more interestingly, we see this increase in solar. And the reason we see this increase in solar is that while we have an increase in demand, we also have an increase in thermal deratings in our natural gas plants. And the capacity expansion model is determining that the way to offset those thermal deratings is not necessarily to build more natural gas plants, but instead to build more solar resources whose generation profile aligns really well with that increasing deratings that we see. And so we really can leverage solar, a low carbon resource, to offset some of these climate impacts that we're seeing. One other thing I will note is that we still have predominantly recirculating cooling in our natural gas combined cycle plants. We gave the model an option to build dry cooling, which would insulate it from most of the river temperature impacts and river availability impacts. And yet we still don't see that investment being a cost-effective investment. So this is without a carbon cap. This is just saying you're not going to force any sort of low carbon into the system. All we're going to tell you is the future profile of capital costs, the future operational profiles of these different, of solar versus the deratings, and then choose what you want to build. But we also force our model with the carbon cap. This is a 50% reduction by 2050 relative to 2015. So basically think of the Clean Power Plan, how I missed the Clean Power Plan. Think of the Clean Power Plan extended from now through 2050. That is roughly a 50% decrease. And what we see is pretty similar. We see a slight increase in installed capacity to get some more renewables on the system to meet that goal of carbon reductions. But by and large, we see similar investment decisions. And so I've put these side by side. The top three graphs are no carbon cap. The bottom three are with the carbon cap. And one thing that really jumps out is if you plan for climate change, if you look in the future and say, we know some climate change is baked in already, and we're going to get to maybe a 4.5 world, how can we build our system to be reliable in the face of that in a cost-effective manner? You would choose to build solar. And if on the left-hand side, you said, oh, forget climate change, I'm just gonna plan for a 50% carbon cap, you would actually build less solar because you can substitute from natural gas for coal and you can meet your carbon cap that way. And so there's this really interesting synergy between planning for adaptation, for climate change, for making your system robust against those future climate impacts, and for meeting your mitigation goals. And that is what we see when we compare that top row versus that vertical change. So across these two papers, the key takeaways I'd say are, well, climate change is coming and it will affect power systems. And these two papers are examples of how we can approach this problem from a systems level perspective, to think of the power system as an integrated whole, as something that operates by trading off resources and by bringing power from different places. And in our first paper in particular, we thought about a time series approach. How do these different changes under climate change compound one another? Do demand and thermal deratings overlap with one another? Are they synchronous? And are they going to exacerbate our planning needs under the presence of both of them? And we found, yes, they're going to occur at the same time. You not only need to build for more demand, but you also likely are going to need to build to replace the thermal deratings that are going to happen during those high demand periods. And so that's a compounding threat to power systems. And we need to think of all these impacts together to capture that. And in the second paper, what we found is that if we do take all these future impacts, we build them into a planning model, put them into the planning process essentially, we do see significant shifts in our investment decisions. And in particular, we see a shift towards low carbon sources of power. We see a significant increase in our solar investment decisions to offset some of those natural gas investments that we would otherwise have made. And so system planners are dealing with multiple challenges, and probably the one at the top of mind across the United States and across much of the globe is really thinking about mitigation. How can we meet our climate targets? How can we reduce our carbon emissions? But that does not need to come at the expense of planning for climate change impacts in the future. And this work, especially that second paper, is demonstrating that we should be thinking about these things together at the same time. Because if you don't plan for climate change, that can pose some serious challenges to you. And if you do plan for climate change, that can have some nice co-benefits for your mitigation goals as well. So with that, I just want to thank our funding sources, the NSF and Paulina, who brought me onto that project. and also the National Renewable Energy Lab and Carlo Brancucci, who brought me on to that project. And this work was authored in part by NREL, but I am no longer with NREL, and I do not represent anything from NREL. And finally, I just want to say, if you or someone you know, maybe one of your children, maybe one of your friends, whoever are interested in a PhD, I am recruiting and I would love to talk. You can visit my website below. You can just email me. You can drop in on one of our lab meetings discussing energy justice and just transitions, whatever. But please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, thanks so much for coming. Thank you for your attention. And please let me know if you have any questions.
Okay. So there is one question right now. I'm reading it. It's from Seth Blumsack. He wants to know regarding the picture in slide 9. Oh, you can read it too. On power system planning, how do we reconcile this story with what we observe about flat or even failing electricity demand in many areas over time?
Yeah, so thanks very much for the question, Seth. So the regression that we run is not trying to think about what kind of non-climate change impacts might occur to demand. So you're right that we have seen flat or even falling electricity demand, especially since the Great Recession, for instance. On the other hand, we might expect to see significant increases due to electrification. We have increasing electric vehicles, we have heat pumps, and I believe Parth presented on some of his research on that earlier. So we're trying to just pull out the impact of climate change on demand, assuming that there's not going to be any of these broader economic drivers of changes in demand. With that said, one thing that I'm very interested in is thinking about how our mitigation efforts might exacerbate these. And so if electric vehicles, given current battery technology, have less of a range at high temperatures, then in the middle of the summer, we might be charging our electric vehicles even more, and we might see a larger increase in electricity demand as a result. And that means that when we look at climate change, we might see an even larger increase in demand relative to just thinking about electrification trends, for instance. So I think it's a really important component. We are not addressing it here.
Okay. Then from Carla Guerra, have you included or hope to include energy storage systems in the models?
So in this work, we did not look at energy storage. Another topic that I'm very interested in the future, and if we go back to one of these first slides, like this one, we've got some of the key components of power systems on the right-hand side. You could think of others. Transmission could be a big one, and energy storage systems are a big one. Maybe not so now, but absolutely in the future. And so let's say we go with a high renewable system and we build a lot of storage for that. We know that batteries, like I said, given current technologies, degrade at higher temperatures at a faster rate. And so how would climate change your investment decisions for energy storage? Does it make it less favorable? Would you still build it, but you just need to build a lot more? And so I would love to do that. Things that I'm trying to do. Apparently it's really busy being a professor. Somebody should have warned me about that. But I would love to look at that in the future. And if you're interested in looking at that, then please email me and we should absolutely talk.
Any other questions? I don't see any more questions. Oh, there's one. From Brendan Daly, sorry about that. Are human behavior technology advances such as energy efficiency and smart devices such as this Nest smart thermostat factored into your modeling?
No, thank you very much for the question. We did not include that in any of our modeling, and yeah, all these questions are so great and trying to get at what I really see as we have mitigation efforts going on. We have changes in how we consume electricity or how we might plan for systems. So how might these interact with one another? So you can imagine if we have smart thermostats, then we might be able to take some of that increase in peak demand and shift it to off-peak hours. The shifting to off-peak hours is going to be affected by your thermal, how much thermal mass you can store in your building, and that will change under future climate. So we do not include any of that in this modeling. Another thing I would absolutely love to look at, and I think would slightly reduce that increase in peak demand, although I think the extent of which is still an open question.
From Lu Liu, do you plan to take a look at power plant siting in the future? They'd be interested to see how climate change affect new power plant siting decisions.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the capacity expansion model that we presented, and actually I can show you maybe the formulation for the model that we ran. So this model is choosing your investment decisions. This is the model underlying that second research paper. And we have this investment decision variable X, which is a binary variable, but that binary variable is representing different plant types at each location across the Southeast. So the capacity expansion model that we ran for the Southeast does have location specific siting embedded in it. And so we did look at that, and I would have to get back to you if you send me your email and you're interested on that, or shoot me an email. We can absolutely get back to you about how those, the locational change of those investments. I think it's also really interesting from a profit maximizing perspective. I'm going to build something and I expect to generate revenues on it and make money on it for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, if you're doing that, then you're going well beyond mid-century. And so planning for climate change, both for wind and solar assets and for your thermal and hydropower assets, I think would be really important.
Okay, then from Eduardo Guerra, what would be the impact of hydrogen technology to use the excess renewable and shift peaks for better utilization of utility deployed assets?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think that is a very interesting one. Something I'm not very familiar with hydrogen technology. I know you can use fuel cells to generate from hydrogen, but I believe you can also use combustion turbines slightly tweaked. And the combustion turbines would likely see some efficiency reduction at these high temperatures. Not sure about fuel cells. But in general, do we expect that these impacts would change the overall value of hydrogen in our system? And I think that you would still value it, you would still want it. And depending on what your seasonality is, which is typically what we think about with hydrogen, storing for very long periods of time. If your seasonality is already meaning you need to move renewables from winter, spring, fall into the summer, then hydrogen could be even more valuable, and you'll need more of it to compensate for these significant increases in the summer that we see in peak demand. So another great question that I don't have a great answer to that I would love to look more at. I don't think you would not want hydrogen anymore, especially in high renewable systems, but you just might want more of it depending on what the difference in shifts in renewable resources is versus the difference in how we see increases in demand and thermal deratings playing out.
Okay. Seth, again, he says real power system generation planning decisions are made sequentially, looking forward a few years, and don't really involve a multi-decadal foresight. Does the model solve the planning problem in the sequential way, or does it solve the planning problem for a single future period? If the latter, how would you speculate that sequential decisions would impact investment choices?
Yeah, thank you very much, Seth. So our model solves in 5-year time steps. And so it is moving in a sequential fashion. It does not have a look ahead period, nor is it solving 5-year increments for the whole shot. One thing, so I think one implication of your question is, if we're just solving sequentially, or if you're just planning sequentially, you just look 5 years out, and then you look 5 years out, and then you look 5 years out. You might be investing in things that look good over a 5-year horizon, but don't look good over a multi-decade horizon. And that can result in stranded assets that are passed on to ratepayers if you're in a vertically integrated utility territory, like much of the Southeast is, or that might mean that an investor is just going to get wiped out on their investment. So in the real world, I think that's a really great question, and something that should be reflected in planning periods to extend them to longer periods. You could argue mitigation dollars investments now are worthwhile in 20, 30 years. And so extending that horizon could be valuable. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it at that. But we do solve sequentially, and I do think that if you were to solve sequentially in the real world, you might see some of those stranded assets. The reason why we don't necessarily see many stranded assets could be because reference investments don't have any thermal deratings. And so once we start stepping forward in time under the future scenarios, we see those deratings, and we might see some already. And so we might have less stranded assets than you would in reality.
Okay. The next one is again from Lou. Have you looked at climate change impacts on transmission lines?
No, we did not. We have interregional flows in our Southeast system, but we did not model how climate change would affect those transmission lines in terms of how much they can actually transmit or what their thermal line ratings are. There are a few papers on that, but not many. In our review, we have a section, the 2018 review, we have a section on transmission lines and papers. The only one that comes immediately to mind is another student of Mike Chester's from 3 years ago. So I think that's would be worth a lot more research, especially when we talk again about future energy systems. We're going to transport renewables very long distances. We're going to build out all these transmission lines. Are you accurately representing how much transmission you actually need, or are you significantly underrepresenting that investment because a lot of those lines are not going to be as useful to you as you thought they were because of increasing temperatures?
Arthur asks, are deratings or failures highly spatially correlated? How much can transmission and or further spatial distribution of distributed energy resources help?
Yeah, our deratings or failures highly spatially correlated. So we are, first of all, we are estimating deratings. We are not modeling forced outage rates. There are papers on that temperature dependency, like by Sinnott Murphy, who is now at NREL, but we're focused more on deratings. And then how much can transmission and or further spatial distribution of DERs help? So the spatial correlation, that's a good question that I don't have a backup slide or a specific figure for you. I do think that transmission could help depending on the type of event that you're talking about. And DERs, if you're worried about your transmission line, like their tolerance against high temperatures and having that transmission capacity when you want it available, if you expect that to decline as temperatures increase, which we generally would, then having more locally sourced generation sources like DERs could help. Although again, in those very high temperatures, especially given the heat island effect in cities, you might see less generation from your solar, but things like distributed fuel cells could absolutely help. I will get back to you, Arthur, on the spatial correlation, but I think at least across a study system like Texas, we would expect to see high spatial correlation. I'm not sure if the Southeast is too large for that, and Paulina might have a better sense for that than me.
Well, I'm not up for the spatial correlation, but because the current models don't currently account for like very deeply for transmission, basically the model is assuming transmission is available, like infinitely available. So in that sense, we're seeing the model is already assuming that transmission is just, if transmission helps, it would show that. So if anything, transmission could just make the results more striking in terms of the ratings.
Yeah. Yeah, just finally on that question, but that was one of the motivations, this spatial correlation, for the work that we did to understand how these impacts might compound one another. Because if you do have high spatial correlation, then you are much worried about deratings than otherwise. The second paper and the first paper both treat those regions as subregions. The first Texas paper is doing 8 different linear regressions for different weather zones in Texas. And the Southeast paper is doing 4 different regional electricity demand relationships. So we are capturing the extent to which those different regions have spatial correlation in their increases in demand. And we are capturing that implicitly in our results by looking at where power plants actually are. I just don't have a figure for you, which I wish I did. Sorry, Arthur.
Yeah. Okay. So I think the final thoughts are for Michael on what do you see next? What are you working on? And then we go back to Elizabeth, I think.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, just let me say thanks again very much for the questions, for coming. What's next? First of all, I hope what's next is finding a PhD student. So if somebody's looking for a PhD, please reach out to me. Things that I think are next in this line of research that I am actively trying to pursue and would love to talk to you if you're interested in them for collaborations or otherwise, just to talk, is thinking really about this mitigation adaptation question. If we put climate change impacts into planning decisions, are we driving forward low carbon options? And is that another way that we can get a mitigation without having to put in a policy like a carbon caps or a carbon tax, or really moving regions to think more deeply about climate mitigation? And so that could be a nice co-benefit of it. I'm also very interested, as many of the questions we're getting at, that we are planning to change our systems a lot in the near future to mitigate carbon emissions, things like building a lot more renewables, building a lot of transmission lines, or we'll see what happens with that, but that's at least what the plans say, building a lot of storage, including hydrogen. And so these investments are not immune to climate change. They could suffer consequences as the climate changes as well. And so thinking about these climate change impacts and how they might change your investment decisions, and making sure that all these investments you're making in mitigation assets are not going to be devalued by climate as it changes around them, I think is another really interesting question that could really improve outcomes, increase the cost effectiveness of our investments, and ultimately help us get to that low carbon future that we want without wasting money or having stranded assets along the way. So thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers again.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Elizabeth. Can I ask one question before we wrap up?
Sure.
I was really curious. I mean, this is really kind of in the front of my mind, because I look at all of the critical infrastructure, be it, you know, energy system, water system, whatever, really changing in the future. And yet there's a gap between the type of research you're doing, and I think Seth's question alluded to it, how planning actually happens. So if you were setting up kind of a training series for today's energy planners, what would you want them to look at? How would you educate them? How would you begin to make this type of information par for the course in energy system decision making?
Sure. So I think first is establishing climate change and establishing that these are not far off things that are going to happen later on to motivate why we even care about it in the first place. I'd love to learn more about how these different systems are planning their systems. My understanding is that it tends to be in this sequential manner without multi-decade foresight embedded into it. And so I'd want to just have some sort of dialogue, better understanding, maybe collating all these different planning. And then I'd really want to walk through these different types of impacts that we expect from climate change. And the tricky thing is that they vary a lot across space. Changes in hydropower in California from the Sierra Nevadas are very different than what we expect to see hydropower changes in the Southeast, let alone at a global scale. We see very different changes in hydropower there. Wind, solar resources also vary a lot across space. And so I think it's really hard to establish like a national level, here's what you should do. But I think it would be really valuable to go through these different resources that utilities care about and are thinking of investing in, talk about the different risks that they're exposed to, and talk about the different types of data that we can use to get a sense for what the risk exposure is. And then finally, to, just like this research is doing, try to stitch all those things together into the planning process. If we're planning just 5 years into the future, can we extend that horizon? And if not, can we at least look 5 years in the future and take these climate impacts and put them into it? Or at least do some external calculations for 40 years and put them into that model.
Well, and it's not only the utility people, but it's also the regulators who then need to kind of approve these costs, right? And so there's a whole education component for our public utility commissions and the others who need to say that it's okay for you to consider these risks as you're making your decision. So this is really interesting research as we're going forward. So thank you so much for presenting such a compelling argument for a topic that I think is on a lot of our minds. I mean, reliability goes down when the substation's underwater.
Right, absolutely.
So.
And one final point on that is another paper that we're preparing is looking at some sort like outages, basically, if you don't plan for it and this comes for you. And so I think the framing of this is not some extra cost you have to bear to change your investments. I think the framing, speaking of the regulators and trying to justify why these assets and investments are necessary, framing it as it's actually going to save you money in the long run. And if you build that natural gas combined cycle plant on this river, we're pretty sure that river is not going to be providing you the cooling needs that you need. And so you're going to have that asset sitting there on the books, or you're going to have to pass it all on to your ratepayers and close it. And so framing it not as a cost, added cost, but rather as reducing your costs once you look far enough into the future and really generating these benefits for ratepayers, and especially making mitigation investments, I think is really important framing, given that, just like you said, really good point that it's also about the regulators and even the policymakers.
Hey, Paulina, thank you so much for co-hosting this. It was just great to hear your questions. And Michael, thank you for a super talk. I mean, this is a really important and interesting topic, and I am really glad that everybody has been able to participate in this series. And we have some more events, which Stephanie will be putting up now. The super Stephanie, the invisible wizard that makes this all happen. Thank you, Stephanie, too. We've got Destiny Knott from Carnegie Mellon, who will be speaking on August 12th, Jesse Jenkins from Princeton, and then Stephanie Lenhart will be speaking on September 9th. So another few weeks, and we're planning now the schedule for the spring term. So like Michael, looking for new PhD students, if you have people or you want to come and speak in this series, contact me. We'll get your name on the list, and we'd love to highlight new energy, fresh assistant professors and postdocs who are working in this area who want an audience and want to be part of this conversation. So thank you, everybody. We look forward to the continued conversation, and thank you, Stephanie, for your help in making this happen too. Bye, Polly. Bye, Michael.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.